Well, good afternoon, everyone. I hope you're having a great trade fair, that you're meeting interesting people and gaining insight from the previous master classes and conferences. My name is Ulysse Revadon-Tanville. I'm working at NewEra, the New European Reuse Alliance, as the Public Affairs Coordinator. And today I will be moderating this session, Unlock a Reuse Revolution and Address Environmental Impact to Inform Policy Decision Making. Joining me to discuss this pivotal topic, we have Bahar Koyuncu, Senior Policy Officer for Plastic at the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, and Joe Papineschi, Chairperson at Eunomia. I will do a brief introduction to the context before giving the floor to the two panelists. So this roundtable takes place within the context of the final stage of the legislative journey of the packaging and packaging waste regulation. As explained yesterday by the member of the European Parliament, Mrs. Catherine Chabot, the PPWR has been very intensely lobbied, particularly regarding the Article 29, formerly Article 26, the one on reuse. Negotiations have notably centered around whether reuse is indeed an environmentally beneficial solution. Indeed, in the past year, there has been numerous reports that has been published. Like for example, you might have heard of the one from McDonald's with the published by Kearney, the no silver bullets, and the idea there has been comparison between reusable packaging versus single-use packaging using LCAs, so life cycle analysis, ou en français, les analyses du cycle de vie. So there has been many reports, so the one from Kearney, there has been the one from Rumble, for example, that was commissioned by the European Paper Packaging Alliance. While those reports favor single-use packaging, independent studies, including those by the European Commission Joint Research Center, for example, or Eunomia, or the European Oriental Bureau, Minderu, Ellen MacArthur Foundation, or Zero Waste Europe, present contrary findings. All those publications have influenced the legislative process for the PPWR. It created uncertainty among policymakers about which conclusion to trust. Hence, today we've decided to address the need to put science at the heart of the debates and at the heart of policy making. To kick things off, Bahar Koyuncu from the Ellen MacArthur Foundation will present the Foundation's latest study on scaling reusable packaging, providing a forward-looking perspective, focusing more on the strategies for fostering reuse rather than on the LCA. Bahar, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Does it work? Is it working? Yeah, okay, it has to be closer. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, it's a pleasure to be here with you today, and thank you very much for the kind invitation. So I will be taking you through the main learnings of our study on reuse revolution. But before I do that, I would like to say a few words about the work we do at the MacArthur Foundation. Let's see if this works. Am I too soft? Is it just a green button? I always have problems with the...
I think they are checking.
I don't know if it was me or... Okay. We work towards accelerating the transition to a circular economy, and we do that by collaborating with the businesses, governments, academia, NGOs, and many others. And we have been working on the topic of reuse for many years now. I would like to give two examples. One is the reuse, even closer, but okay. Maybe can I try? Yeah. Does this work? Oh, yeah. Okay, sorry. So the Reuse Rethinking Packaging publication that came out in 2019 showcased examples from all around the world on the best-in-class examples of reuse. In this publication, we also put together a framework on the different reuse models, so the refill models and also the return models, where the businesses own the packaging, whereas on the refill models where the packaging is actually being refilled by the user. And it's really a pleasure to see all these different solutions being present at this fair in these 2 days. We are also working on an initiative called the Global Commitment. This is actually representing 20% of the global packaging value chain, bringing together more than 1,000 organizations. And the common vision is really to stop plastic packaging becoming waste. And the companies have set up targets to bring that vision to life. And there's a transparent annual reporting taking place every year. We see that progress is being made on certain areas, such as increasing recycled content and elimination of some of the most problematic plastic packaging. However, on certain areas, such as increasing or achieving 100% recyclable or reusable plastic packaging, the targets are not there yet. So it doesn't work again. Sorry. Ah, yes. So we have identified 3 pivotal hurdles looking into the progress in the 5 years that we have had with the companies that are signatories to this initiative. And one big hurdle is around reuse. What we see is that around 60% of the companies have actually pilots in place. However, the needle is not moving much. In the last 5 years, it has been consistently below 2%. So in this context, what we wanted to do was really to see how can we envision a future-proof reuse system that can compete economically and environmentally and also experientially with a single use. So we have looked into different sectors. I will share with you what we have modeled a bit more in detail. So we looked into the beverages, the personal care, food cupboard, and fresh food. For example, the yogurt parts. So for the beverage industry, we looked into PET bottles going into returnable PET and glass alternatives. Personal care using HDPE bottles going to returnable PE bottles. Food cupboard from flexible PP packaging to returnable containers. And then fresh food I think it's a typo, sorry, container, PP container to a returnable polyprop container. And all this work was done actually in collaboration with Eunomia and Systemic, who has done all the modeling work, and with 60 partnering organizations. And we looked into 3 different variables to understand the impact that it has on the performance of reuse systems that are return-based. So scale of and sharedness of infrastructure, meaning how much of the packaging is switching to reuse, and the community of that infrastructure. The packaging system, meaning the standardization of the packaging, and also the return rate of the packaging that is that's being utilized. So this is a bit of a complicated slide, but what we can say now is, if you have the 2% still in mind, it very much represents what we have on the very right-hand side, the fragmented effort, okay? So here the packaging is really very distinct for the different companies. Return rates are relatively small, around five times. Going into a bit more ambitious level, it would be the collaborative approach. So market share around 10% going to reuse. The packaging characteristics are more standardized, with the packaging being reused around 10 times. And then going to a systems change. This is very interesting, going to a market share of 40% and getting a reloop of 15 times for the packaging. So these scenarios are modeled to basically to show the impact it has on the different parameters. So what we see when we look into the modeling outcome is that for the different sectors, except for the food cupboard, where there is fragmented effort, which very much represents the current scenario that we have actually. There are always greenhouse gas saving emissions for the scenarios, at least, that we have looked into, ranging from 35% to 70% for the systems change scenario. So, and what you can also see in this graph is that the higher the level of collaboration in the system, the higher the level of standardization, the higher the number of savings, as you can see. So I don't know if I should just stand up maybe, but oh, it's not very readable. So this would be like the system change scenario, and this would represent the scenario of today, and you see that really the numbers get more and more quantified as there's more collaboration in the system. The same is true for plastic usage, of course. Only in the case of food cupboard, because we are then going from flexible, very light polyprop packaging to, rigid, heavy polyprop containers. Then there is an increase in terms of plastic usage in the fragmented effort. But for the rest, still, based on the number of per cycle use, there is always a reduction in usage of material. The same is true for water usage. There are significant savings of water when we look into the different scenarios for all the different sectors. And this is driven by the fact that the water use for production is much more compared to the water use that is used for cleaning of reusable packaging. And I know that this was a highly debated issue also in the context of PPWR-related studies. Now let's look into the question of economics, the tough one, right? So the environmental picture is quite clear. We do see big significant benefits when we switch to reuse systems. On the economical side, what we see is that when we look into the current context, of course, the single-use systems and packaging are highly optimized, right? When we compare the two, the reusable packaging is actually more expensive. But then again, as we have more collaboration in the system, as we have more pooling in the system, the cost can actually be driven down, and it can become cost competitive for the beverage industry and the personal care industry. So that's what you see here. And also what we expect is that with expected changes in the regulation, the business case for returnable packaging will only become more and more stronger. So here you see the example of food cupboard, the current price that's reflected, and what would be the price in the orange bar here for returnable packaging version. But then with the new regulations coming, also the change in EPR fees, for example, for flexible packaging, we estimate that actually in a few years' time, probably they are going to become cost parity, and it will really become cost competitive versus single-use alternatives. So we talked about 3 key performance drivers. I don't know how much time we have, but I'm almost finished. The scale and sharedness of infrastructure is really key. Packaging standardization and pooling as well, and also the return rate. So the different parameters that we looked into have a huge impact. And here you can see the visualization of how aggregated packaging can enable a common system for more localized sorting and cleaning of these packaging that is returned back to the system by the users, so that it doesn't have to actually travel all the long distances that would be required if the system and the sharedness is not there. And also, in terms of filling, if there is some level of standardization of packaging designs, it can go into the nearest fillers, then again traveling long distances, simplifying and of course also causing environmental benefits. And this also streamlines packaging sorting and cleaning centers overall. Let's see, yes, it works. I think overall, what I would like to just say is that we need a major transformation to go into returnable waste reuse packaging, but we have the foundations, and we just need the collaboration between all the different stakeholders to enable that. The higher the level of the transformation in the system, the higher the level of benefits, both in terms of environmental benefits and also economic benefits. And I think with this, I would like to hand the floor over to you and Joe. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bahar, for this very interesting presentation and for this call to collaboration. I think today is a great example of how we can all collaborate to create this great transformation. Now I will give the floor to Joe Papineschi, please.
Thanks very much. So this was the question the European Commission was trying to answer, and the co-decision makers when they were legislating the packaging and packaging waste regulation. And I'm going to talk a bit about how easy it is to confuse policymakers with that question. But just a quick introduction to Eunomia. We work with everybody in this argument, this debate, from the policymakers at supranational level and national level. So we were the main advisors to the European Commission on the PPWR. But also with cities, with brands, startups and global brands, and with NGOs. So we have the privilege of seeing this from all different perspectives. And I'm going to start with trying to explain why our starting point was that reuse is an extremely important concept. And this is really working backwards from first principles. So you can find this report easily online. And what it's really doing is illustrating that we have this planetary boundary around climate change that requires us to stay within our carbon budget. We have to get to net zero, but we have to do that whilst staying within an absolute carbon budget if we want to meet the commitments made in Paris in 2015. And this is showing that we currently emit about 50 billion tons of CO2 per year, and about a quarter of that relates to materials, and about 80% of that relates to plastic, aluminium, steel, and cement. And we did this study to look at if each of those sectors does everything they intend to do to decarbonize, including things which are frankly quite unlikely to happen in the timescales that those sectors are claiming, then we still overshoot that carbon budget by 100% by 2050. And that's a problem for all four of those materials, and in fact, all materials. This is just an example from the situation with plastic. If we do nothing, if we carry on with business as usual, we'll spend at 1/3 of the whole carbon budget for everything by 2050 just on our plastic consumption, very heavily driven by single-use plastic applications. The budget you can see on the far left-hand side, far right-hand side is even if we do everything we're intending to do, it's less than 1/3 of what we'll emit with all of the decarbonisation that we're currently planning. So that delta has to be made up from extracting much more utility from a much smaller amount of material. And so just to put that into perspective, rather than growing by 4% a year, we need to reduce plastic consumption, according to this analysis, by 3% a year. And in absolute terms, that means per capita, global consumption of plastic needs to reduce by 75% by 2050. And in France or Europe or North America, by much more, because we're going to redistribute that consumption more fairly, hopefully, by 2050. So you might be looking at 90% in high-income countries. That situation for plastic has got worse very recently because we now have this new data from the International Energy Agency on fugitive emissions observed from satellites. So the carbon footprint of all plastics has gone up our understanding of it has gone up by 15 to 20% in the last year. And so everything I just showed you is actually too optimistic. So that means reuse has to play a really significant role if we want to have the material prosperity that we get from having access to plastic. These studies were referred to by Ulysse at the start of the session. This is a nice short paper by some Italian LCA experts comparing 4 studies, including the Eunomia study, against a set of criteria for how you robustly evaluate a reuse versus single-use comparison. And you can see the one on the left with all of the red. Red isn't good here, by the way. Red is bad. That's the McDonald study that was referred to earlier. That study is it will be a case study for many years in effective lobbying of European decision making. I'll give you one example from it in a moment, but it's a classic example of very robustly presented bad science having a huge political impact. You can see on the right, I mean, I'm kind of happy that our study comes out looking the best of these 4. What I can tell you is that it was by far the lowest funded of these studies as well. So it's not that difficult to do not too bad a job here. Next one. Can we go straight to the next one? This is you can find this online as well, but I'll just show you this one comparison. So from the McDonald's study, the maximum return rate that they assumed for reusable packaging was 70%. And so that's giving you, basically the difference between that and 90%, which is the minimum required for beverage packaging and single-use beverage packaging under the Single-Use Plastics Directive, is a 300% difference in material intensity. So just changing that one assumption makes a huge difference, and that's one of the points that Bahar made in her presentation as well, that variable is one of the very few that really makes a huge difference to these answers. This is just an example of in fact, this is the Eunomia study of those 4 comparing takeaway packaging. It's just a comparison between a particular reuse system and a single-use system. It's based on the TOMRA system, which is being demonstrated outside this conference. And this is just a very simple way of showing how you actually make a fair comparison. What is the break-even return rate versus the reuse system and the single-use system? Does that look plausible? Do you think that you can get to 83%? Probably. Do you think you can get to 98%? That's more difficult, but it's maybe not impossible. But that's how policymakers need to be thinking about these questions. And then you can see, you can easily translate that into the number of rotations required to see the break-even point between one system and another system. I just want to raise one last technical point, which is about carbon emissions tunnel vision. Bahar talked about water as well in the EMF study, but it's really important we don't just think about carbon emissions. And when we're thinking about these comparisons between single-use paper and reusable plastic or metal or glass, this is some trade EU import data for pulp used to make paper products, and shows that in the last 20 years we've transitioned to 75% of our imports coming from Latin America. So from a very low base, that has increased by 3 times in the last 20 years. That's partly being driven by brands buying certified pulp in Latin America and in Europe, but that gap being made up from new demand for cheaper Latin American pulp, some of which we strongly suspect is being grown in recently deforested land. So there are lots of consequences, obviously we all know this, beyond just looking through the carbon lens. So the one thing which we're working on right now is a new software tool to try to demystify all of this. It's intended to be a completely transparent tool which anyone will be able to use and which will be able to make these comparisons in a completely objective way, as much as we have the data. So if you were interested in that, we have our stand is somewhere in the middle, E13 maybe, I think. And sorry, the writing's a bit small here, but just a few quick takeaways to leave you with. I think, number one is that we have enough knowledge already to say that this transition is necessary to keep us within planetary boundaries. And from an EU point of view, it makes strategic sense from an industrial strategy, from a geopolitical, geostrategic point of view. So we're glad we made some progress with PPWR, but there really is an argument for that to go a lot further. Obviously, we've seen that LCA and other analytical techniques can be manipulated to produce any answer you like. But I think with policymakers asking the right questions, it's possible to avoid a lot of the problems that we've experienced with things like PPWR. And then lastly, I think we already have enough data to show that reuse and refill, we don't know exactly how and where and exactly what these systems are going to look like, but we know enough to know that they are going to beat single use, at least from an environmental point of view, in many, many use cases. So that's not really able to be disputed. And I'm going to hand back to...
Thank you very much, Joe, for this very, very interesting presentation. I had prepared 2 questions, but I think we are a bit out of time, so maybe I will directly open the floor for question. I don't know if anyone has a question to ask to our speakers. Please raise your hand. Okay, perfect. Tu veux? Merci.
You have 10 minutes here, if you want to do the questions.
Thank you for 2 great presentations. Can you leave us with a bit of hope? Is there any progress on the front of making more comparable LCA studies? How can we help push for that and make sure that LCAs coming out follow best practice and are credible?
Yeah, I think the number one thing that people should be calling for is transparency. If you can see how, one issue with, for instance, the McDonald's Kearney LCA was that really only 2 or 3 of the assumptions used were ever published. There was enough there to be able to reverse engineer it. If you really knew what you were doing, you could get a reasonable idea of what was happening. But I think the thing which stakeholders, which policymakers, NGOs, industry really need to be pushing for is transparency. And then you can, with a bit of knowledge, you can do a good interpretation. Things like the resim tool that we're developing at the moment, that's intended to provide something of a standard for doing that. But really this isn't that difficult. The issue with PPWR was more that was the timing. There wasn't probably quite enough published, so your study was fantastic, but it kind of arrived right at the very end of the process, so we didn't have those resources there. But also I think the policymakers weren't ready for the types of lobbying they were going to experience, and so I think next time maybe they'll be better prepared, but yeah, I don't think it's that difficult to avoid that kind of false solutions being promoted.
I fully agree with everything that you have said, Joe. Maybe just to add on it, I think it's very important that actually there's an objective approach while these studies are being designed, and it's not designed in a way to generate a certain outcome. And yeah, with transparency, the assumptions behind and the rationale for those assumptions are also very important, because that can hugely influence the results. And then especially on reuse, like we are always talking about the fact that single use is it has been on the market for several years. It's an optimized system. So I think it's also important to do like a scenario modeling for the future to see how reuse can really have an impact in terms of environmental economic performance in the future, because if we just take the current status quo, of course on some parameters single use may look more beneficial, but in the future it will be very different with also upcoming regulation and with the system change that we are foreseeing. So
just to add one thing to that, which is that if you have transparency, so just to give you an example, the JRC, the Joint Research Centre of the European Commission, published a huge study of reuse versus single-use systems recently. And they did a very similar comparison to the one we did on takeaway packaging. And we were able to see exactly why their results were different to our results. And it was mostly because they took a very traditional approach of saying, we're going to assume the current energy mix, the current grid mix, the current transport infrastructure, whereas we were trying to look 10 years ahead, and so we were using more electrification of transport, more renewables in the grid. And when you have transparency, you can see why the different studies produce different answers. Our view would be that if you're trying to make long-term investment decisions or policy decisions, you should be thinking about how the grid and how transport is going to change, driven by known policies and trends, rather than assuming everything is, we're stuck in the current paradigm. But I think the transparency then allows you to understand why different studies get different answers.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Do we have another question, or we can close this session? Well, I think we're all good. It was very clear. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you very much, Bahar.